How's it going? My name is Cameron, also known as Venus Theory, and in this video, I'm here to show you how you can use PSP MixSaturator and BussPressor to add a bit more weight and punch to your mixes. Bus processing, in case you don't know, is adding effects to the master output bus or the stereo bus of your mix. This is a great way to add that final level of detail, polish, and weight to a mix before you ship it off to a mastering engineer, or it can act as a great first step in your own mastering process. So in this video, I'll be demonstrating how we can use saturation, compression, and a couple other bonus tips with EQ to add a bit more polish, weight, and thump to a mix before we get into the mastering process. So let's dive in and get started. Alright guys, so here we are in Bitwig, and like I said, in this video, I wanted to talk you through some tips for bus processing on your mixes. So I've got this kind of like dark R&B, modern pop slash, I guess, pop trap type of loop here, and I wanted to just show you the loop by itself, the loop with the processing, and then just walk you through getting from A to B. So let's go ahead and take a listen to the loop now. So the mix is definitely done. Everything's sitting really well together. There's not really anything else that needs adjusted all that much. But the only thing is the mix maybe just feels a bit flat. So let's go ahead and engage the bus processing now and take another listen. So you can hear this makes the mix stand up a bit more. It's a bit more upfront, a bit more aggressive, and everything just feels nice and glued together and a lot more cohesive. So that is really the idea of bus processing, is just adding a little bit of extra spicy sauce to kind of glue a mix together and make everything sit well before you get into the mastering stage, or it can act as a great first step in your mastering chain. So let's go ahead and walk through the entire process here. So the first thing I reach for when I'm doing this kind of bus processing is PSP MixSaturator 2. Now, usually the only controls I'm going to reach for in this case is maybe the saturation amount and the input. That's really all I usually touch. I usually only just adjust the input. I might feed more signal or drop it down, depending on just kind of what I'm going for and what I'm feeling. So really how I'll do this is just kind of play the loop and drive up the input until it feels like it's too much, and then just back off a little bit. So let's go ahead and do that now. So that's probably a bit too much. So right about there is feeling good, and that's usually about the level I'll go for. I'll usually add about 1 to 3 dB of drive or input gain. Any more than that, I feel like it gets too aggressive, especially on a mix bus. However, using this as kind of a creative effect, especially using the mix knob to create it in parallel, can be a good idea, especially on things like a drum bus. So in terms of the other controls and other things to keep in mind, these two controls here, we have the high and low end adjustments. So these are sets of controls that allow you to shape the low and high end. So in the case of this track, let's say maybe the bottom end isn't really coming through as much. We could use this low end control to bring that up. Or let's say the saturation made the top end just too aggressive. We can use the high end controls to shape that. So this is a really good way to adjust the kind of tonal balance after the saturation is taking effect. Finally, from there, there's the saturation amount. Typically, I'll leave this between 10 and 20% for a mix bus. Usually, I just leave it at 20. I'll just drop it if it maybe feels like too much. And then the shape. This is the mode or type of saturation being applied. On a mix, I usually go for valve 2 or tape 1. Those are kind of my two go-to modes. And then I'll just leave output saturation on here or enable it if it's disabled. This way, if there's any super peaky peaks, it's just a nice way to crunch those up and keep things under control. So saturation is a great thing to apply to your mix bus because if you think about it, saturation and distortion is just a way to add harmonic content. This is a really great way to enhance the perceived loudness of a track without squishing the dynamic range or just cranking the level really, really hard. We're adding harmonic content, which makes things just feel a bit bigger and more alive and in your face. So this is a great way just to subtly add that extra bit of oomph to a mix without, over processing something. And that's the key to bus processing, is it's just little subtle tweaks that really add up. So let's move on and talk about bus compression. So for this, I will use PSP BussPressor. This is a great compressor for this type of thing. So bus compression is a little bit different than, I guess, how you would normally use compression in a mix. So when it comes to bus compression settings, if you ask 5 different engineers, you're probably going to get 5 different answers. In my case, I've always gone for a ratio that's relatively low, usually 1.5 to maybe 3. In cases of really aggressive genres like metal or dubstep, I might go all the way up to 4:1. Some people like a higher ratio like 4 or 8:1. Some people like a really low ratio like 1.5:1. I find somewhere in between is usually the best way to go about it. So when it comes to how you should set your bus compressor, the ultimate goal in the end is just to squeeze things together and make everybody play nicely while retaining the transients. So we want to keep that sense of punch and we want to enhance it in a way, but we do want to squeeze the overall level to be a bit more consistent. So to do that, the first thing you want to adjust is your attack. I find a value of probably 30 to 100 is usually the best way to go. In this case, I have it set to about 50 milliseconds. This allows the transients to poke through and the compressor's really only going to grab the loudest parts of the mix, which is what we want to go for. Then in terms of the release, we want to time this to the track. So what I'll watch is just the meter here. So let's go ahead and set the release to something really long. And basically what I want to look for is the meter to reset before the next hit happens that's going to trigger the compressor. In the case of this track and most other genres, that's going to be the kick and the snare. Those are the two main driving elements of the rhythm of this track, and that's what we want to use the compressor to gauge. So I'm going to set this really long, like I said, and we're just going to watch the VU meter, and we want it to reset before that next trigger happens, which is going to be the kick or snare. So let's go ahead and play the loop and adjust the release settings to time it to our track. So we can see this is way too long right now. Let's drop it down. Now we see we're getting close because it's almost resetting. And that's right about perfect. Maybe one more down. So in this case, about 0.4 seconds, this seems to work pretty much ideally. We're getting it to hit the peaks and then it's resetting before that next one comes in. So in terms of the amount of compression you're applying, I usually only like to go for about 2 dB, and this kind of depends on the track and the genre. For something like a really modern rock or hard rock mix or some more modern electronic genres, you might go for a bit more, maybe 3 to 4 dB, but you really don't want to be aggressive with a bus compressor at all. Like I said, the ultimate goal is just a subtle squishing of everything together to make it feel a bit more cohesive. So now that we've got our compressor set and we've got the gain reduction at about 2 dB, let's go ahead and bypass it and then turn it back on and try and listen for the difference this is going to make in the mix. And it's going to be pretty subtle, but if you listen to the timing in between the kick and snare hits, it should be a bit more apparent how this is affecting the mix. So let's go ahead and take a listen without it. And let's go ahead and turn it on. And off. And back on. So again, it's pretty subtle and not totally obvious, but like I said, if you listen for the points in between the kick and snare hits, it just sounds a little more leveled out and a bit more consistent, and the drums still retain that nice snappy punch to them. So that's pretty much it in terms of my bus processing chain, and this makes quite a bit of difference to a mix. But one final tip I have for you guys is adding just one little bus EQ on the end. In this case, I really like the sound of the E27 SE. If you guys have seen the mastering video I did as well, I also like to use the Noble Q for this purpose. In this case, since this is a pretty modern song, the E27 tends to lend itself better to that. In other cases, the Noble Q might be a good idea because it adds a nice kind of retro character to a song. So what I've got here is a really high frequency boost at 28K, and I'm boosting by maybe 1 dB. And then I'm just enhancing the low end with a low shelf here at 63 hertz by about maybe 1.5 dB. Then I'm giving it just a bit of input drive, value of about 2 here. And then output, I'm just using this to lift the overall level of the track up subtly. This is more personal preference. You could kind of wait for the mastering stage to do this, but I just wanted to get the mix just a bit louder before I get into the mastering process. So let's go ahead and take a listen without it and then turn it on. And with the EQ. Without it. And back on. And that's what I love the E27 for. It just adds this really nice sense of kind of sparkly fairy dust up on the top end, but it can really round out that bottom end and make it feel nice and chunky. And the input drive as well, this can be something fun to mess about with, and it can add quite a bit of character. You got to be careful not to get greedy with it. So usually 1 to maybe 4 dB of input drive is what I'll go for, and 4 again being reserved for more aggressive genres. In this case, this is a pretty chill track, so we're just gonna want to bring it up a bit, but we don't want to make it too aggressive and too obnoxiously heavy. So now we can go ahead and just A/B this whole process again. So let's turn it off. And this is the mix without any bus processing. And back on. So as you can hear, this is a great way to add some punch, clarity, and depth to a mix and just make it stand up and feel a bit more in your face. And like I said, this can be also a really great way to start off your mastering chain by just kind of getting the subtle tweaks ready before you drive things into limiters and compressors to kind of squeeze the final level of the track up to where we would want it to be. So now we can go ahead and turn on the mastering effects here. I've got PSP Vintage Warmer. This is usually my go-to for starting off a master chain. And then I'm just using PSP Xenon here on the end. Really not doing much with it. 1.3 dB of input gain, and transient prediction B at about 57.1% here. So this is after everything is being applied in the master. So we can get this nice, punchy, loud, aggressive, modern mix going. So yeah, that's pretty much it for my bus processing chain. It's only 3 plugins, it only takes a couple minutes, and it's a great way to make your mixes stand up and get a bit more in your face, ready to go for the mastering process. And that's it for this video, so thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and to get these plugins for yourself or find more information, you can go to pspaudioWare.com.